My name is Thesavar Dunn. I hold the rank of Senior Curator of the Vethkal Archive, Third Chamber, which is the chamber reserved for what we call, in the formal language of our institution, the contested boundary records. In common speech, in the refectory when the junior archivists eat their evening meal and lower their voices and glance toward the sealed corridor that leads to my chamber, they call it something else. They call it the room where the files do not open again. I have worked in this institution for 61 cycles. I say that not to establish my authority, though it does establish it, but to give you a sense of what 61 cycles in this particular room does to a mind. The Vethkal Archive is the oldest continuously operating record-keeping institution in the known galaxy. We were founded 11,000 standard years before the first Harith ship left its home system. We have outlasted 17 empires, 9 galactic compacts, 4 attempted purges of our holdings by governments that did not want certain things written down, and 1 event so large that it does not have a proper name in any language currently spoken, only a designation in the archive's internal catalog. Event null, filed under predecessor species, sealed under class absolute, which means that not even I am permitted to read it. I have held the key to class absolute for 9 cycles. I have not used it. Some things are not for the living. I say all of this because I want you to understand what kind of institution this is before I explain what I am doing here, alone, in the middle of the third watch, dictating into a record that I have already marked for immediate sealing upon completion. I am closing a file. That is, in the abstract, the most ordinary thing a senior curator can do. Files are opened when an event begins and closed when an event concludes. In 61 cycles, I have closed more than 4,000 files. Most of them are bureaucratic exercises, territorial negotiations concluded, trade disputes resolved, survey expeditions returned and debriefed. The closing is a formality. You dictate a summary of conclusions. You confirm the disposition of all subrecords. You apply the appropriate classification seal, and you move to the next file. But some files are closed under a classification we call void final. There are, in the third chamber alone, 47 void final files. I have opened all of them. That is not standard practice. A curator is generally expected to work only within their current active caseload. But I was given special dispensation 9 cycles ago by the Archive's Governing Council, because they wanted someone who had read all 47 to be the one who would eventually read the 48th. They knew it was coming. They have known for a very long time. A void final designation means the following, in the precise language of the Archive's classification manual. The event described in this file has no surviving principal parties from one or more of the involved factions. The file is therefore closed not by resolution, but by categorical cessation. No follow-up records are possible from the absent party. The record stands as written. In practice, what void final means is that one side of a conflict sent forces into what the Galactic Atlas marks as human space, and the forces did not come back. And then more forces were sent, and they did not come back. And then the political will for the venture collapsed, or the empire collapsed, or the species collapsed. And we closed the file with a void final stamp because there was no one left on that side to sign a peace agreement. I have read all 47. I know them the way I know old wounds by the texture of the scar, not the sharpness of the original cut. The Dravathi expansion, 3,000 cycles ago. The Kuhn Collective's reclamation campaign, which they announced with considerable public ceremony and which concluded, 800 years later, with the last Kuhn vessel simply ceasing to transmit in the region the Atlas marks with the notation "Do not enter," reason unrecorded. The S-Savith Armada, 30,000 ships, the largest single military mobilization in pre-modern galactic history, launched by a civilization that had spent 400 years preparing for it, that had built an economy around it, that had written it into their foundational mythology as the moment their species would prove itself the rightful inheritor of the galaxy. The S-Saveth Armada crossed into human space in what their own records called the hour of culmination. The archive has 11 transmissions from S-Saveth vessels after that crossing. The longest is 4 seconds of audio. We have had linguists analyze those 4 seconds for 2,000 years. There is a sound in the transmission that is not static and is not speech, and is not any mechanical noise the S-Saveth were known to produce, and no one has ever successfully identified it. The file is sealed. I have read it. I cannot unhear that sound. There are things you learn reading 47 void final files that you cannot learn any other way. You learn the shape of the silence. Every file has a point, a specific transmission, a specific moment in the record where the normal pattern of communication ends. Not jammed, not destroyed by signal degradation. Ended. The transmissions before that point have a quality that is easy to recognize once you have seen it 47 times. They become shorter. They become factual to the point of blankness. And then the last ones, the ones just before the silence, carry a tone that I have seen in 47 different species languages, and that always translates in some form to the same thing. We did not know what we were chasing. That phrase, or something that maps onto it, appears in 41 of the 47 final transmissions. In 6 files, the final transmission contains nothing but coordinates and a status code. Those are, in some ways, the harder ones to read. I had believed, before I began this particular file, that 47 iterations of the same story had given me a kind of immunity. Not indifference. I am not capable of indifference about this subject. 61 cycles in this room cures a person of comfortable indifference, but a professional distance. The kind of distance that allows a physician who has treated the same disease many times to approach the next patient with competence rather than paralysis. I believed I understood what I was dealing with. I believed the 48th would be, at its core, the same as the others. I was wrong, not about the outcome. The outcome is identical to all 47. I was wrong about the distance. I will explain. But first, I want to say something about the nature of a void final file that the classification manual does not say. Because the classification manual is a technical document, and technical documents do not traffic in what things feel like. In 61 cycles, I have developed opinions about what things feel like, and a closing record is a place where such observations are permissible, because a closing record is also, by definition, a record that no one in the immediate institutional hierarchy will read before sealing it. I am speaking into this dictation with the knowledge that the next person to hear these words will be someone who has the authority to open a class-restricted file, which means the next person to hear these words will probably be my successor. I am speaking to that person in particular. What a void final file feels like, when you have read enough of them, is a kind of weight that is not distributed evenly across the reading experience. The early sections of these files are heavy in the ordinary way that records of large events are heavy. The scale of the fleets, the scale of the ambitions, the scale of the civilizations that put their full institutional weight behind a campaign they believed, each of them, was going to resolve the question of human space once and for all. You feel that weight the way you feel the weight of history in any record, diffusely, through accumulation of detail, through the slow comprehension of how much was at stake and how many beings staked it. But the weight in the final sections of a void final file is a different kind. It is concentrated. It does not accumulate. It arrives, suddenly, in a particular transmission, and after that arrival everything else in the file is read under its pressure. The technical term for this in my private notes is the turn. Every file has a turn. Some turns are in the 8th transmission and some are in the 42nd. And some are in a single sentence in a personal log filed by a junior officer who did not survive to know that their observation would stand as the clearest account of the whole event. But they all have one, and after the turn, you are reading a different kind of file. I had read 47 turns. I believed I was prepared for the 48th. The Harith Empire submitted its first official territorial complaint against the humans 314 cycles ago. I was a junior archivist at the time, assigned to the incoming correspondence section, and I remember the document arriving because of the quality of its language. The Harith were, among the many things one could say about them, exceptionally gifted rhetoricians. Their formal documents had a particular cadence, long sentences structured like pursuit formations, each clause advancing the argument one incremental step, each subordinate clause protecting the flanks, every paragraph driving toward a conclusion that felt, by the time you reached it, like an inevitability rather than a claim. Their territorial complaint was a masterwork of the form. I remember filing it and thinking that whatever species had written this was accustomed to winning arguments. The Harith were accustomed to winning most things. They were, in the 300 cycles before that first complaint, one of the most successful expansionist civilizations in the modern galactic period. Not the largest, there have been larger, but among the most efficient. Their expansion campaigns worked on a principle they called the continuous advance, which was exactly what it sounded like. They never stopped, never consolidated behind a front, never allowed the other side the luxury of a defensible position. They moved like a single organism rather than an army. Every species they had ever contested territory with described, in the records they left behind, the same experience. The Harith did not arrive, conquer, and occupy. They arrived and kept arriving, and the space you thought you were defending had already become something else by the time you understood what was happening. In 300 cycles of expansion, the Harith had absorbed or displaced 42 distinct civilizations. Not all of those were violent contests. Some were negotiated incorporations. Some were voluntary alignments. Some were simply the demographic reality that a civilization ceases to maintain a distinct identity after a few generations of Harith administrative overlay. But the core fact held. The Harith moved, and the galaxy rearranged itself around that movement. They were not, by any civilized measure, monsters. I want to be precise about that, because a void final file is the last official record of a species, and I believe that last record should be accurate. The Harith had a rich philosophical tradition, an elaborate system of communal ethics, a method of dispute resolution that other civilizations had genuinely studied and partially adopted. They made art. Their music, what survives of it in our archive, is extraordinary, complex harmonic structures that their biologists believed emerged from the specific architecture of their hearing organs, adapted over millions of years to parsing the sounds of pursuit through dense atmospheric environments. They were, in the full sense of the word, a civilization. They were also, by culture and by biology, hunters, not in the debased metaphorical sense that is sometimes applied to aggressive expansionists, but in the literal, ancestral, encoded in the body sense. Their evolutionary history had produced a species that felt the act of pursuit as a kind of rightness, the way other species feel the rightness of shelter or of warmth. To pursue, to close, to complete, these were not merely tactical options for the Harith. They were the grammar of how they experienced being alive. Their language reflected this at a structural level that was almost impossible to miss once you knew to look for it. The archive's linguists have published several studies of the Harith tense system, which is built not around time, past, present, future, but around stages of pursuit. There are verb forms in Harith that exist only to describe action in the opening stage, the closing stage, the completed stage, and a fourth stage that has no clean equivalent in any other language in the archive's database, and that the linguists have rendered, with some discomfort, as the stage of no longer needing to continue. Every Harith sentence, in every context, from war records to love poetry to administrative budget requests, is conjugated according to which of these four stages the action occupies. The budget requests are, for a Harith linguist, as revealing as the war poetry. A civilization that conjugates its budget requests in the grammar of the hunt, is a civilization whose institutional identity runs all the way down. This matters for understanding what happened. The border incident that precipitated the incursion was, by the account of every neutral observer whose testimony we gathered for the file, ambiguous. A Harith survey convoy operating in a contested transitional zone encountered a human vessel conducting what appeared to be a routine passage through the same zone. The human vessel, by Harith accounts and by the data recovered from the Harith convoy's instruments, altered course 3 times in a short span. The Harith convoy commander interpreted these course alterations as deliberate, as a provocation, specifically, and in the Harith understanding of interspecies communication, a particular kind of provocation, a challenge to the principle of the continuous advance, a statement that here was a boundary the humans expected the Harith to treat as real. Every analyst in the archive who has reviewed this incident has noted the same thing in their commentary. The Harith commander's interpretation may or may not have been correct. The human vessel's course alterations are consistent with several explanations, only one of which is deliberate provocation. We do not know what the human captain intended. We have never known. This ambiguity is, the analysts note, irrelevant to the outcome, but it matters to the record because it means the Harith Empire launched its incursion on the basis of a signal that was, at minimum, not unambiguously hostile. They chose to read it as provocation because provocation was a category their psychology was equipped to act on. Ambiguity was not. What I find, reading this section of the file with full knowledge of the outcome, is that this is the place where I want to reach into the record and speak. Not to change it. Nothing I could say would change it. But I have read, in the Harith commander's own words, the precise moment she decided to begin the pursuit, and in those words, transmitted to Harith High Command before the convoy, was ever within meaningful engagement range of the human vessel. There is a quality I have now seen 47 times in 47 different languages. She was certain, not arrogant certain. There is a difference. Arrogance is a failure of imagination. What the Harith commander had was something else, a complete and sincere model of how pursuit worked, drawn from 300 cycles of perfect results, and she applied that model to this situation with the same confidence a mathematician applies a theorem that has never once failed. She was not reckless. She was not dismissive of the human's capabilities. She had reviewed the available intelligence on human military capacity, and she had found it, in her own words, unusual in several respects, but not fundamentally outside the parameters of opponents the Harith had successfully engaged before. She filed her report and began the pursuit. I have read the subsequent transmissions in sequence, the way you are supposed to read a file, beginning to end, without skipping forward to the conclusion. I have done this with all 47 void final files. It is, in my professional judgment, the only honest way to read them, because these files are the last words of civilizations, and civilizations deserve to have their last words read in the order they were spoken. So I read the Harith commander's first transmission after crossing the transitional zone, in which she noted that contact had been re-established with the human vessel, that the human vessel had again altered course, and that the new course led deeper into the region the galactic atlas marks with the pale, featureless designation I have now looked at for 61 cycles without feeling entirely comfortable looking at it for too long. I read the second transmission, in which she reported that the fleet was maintaining contact without difficulty, that the human vessel's movements remained unhurried. She used that word, unhurried, and underlined it in the formal transmission notation. The Harith used to flag details for command attention, and that there was no indication of distress or evasion. She noted this because it was unexpected. A single vessel being pursued by a Harith fleet should have been, by every established behavioral model, either accelerating toward help or attempting evasion. It was doing neither. I read the third, fourth, and fifth transmissions. They maintained the same factual quality. The fleet was closing. The human vessel was not evading, not signaling, not accelerating beyond what appeared to be a standard transit speed. The Harith commander noted that she had run probability analyses on 14 possible explanations for the human vessel's behavior. The analysis had not converged on any explanation with sufficient confidence to be reported as a finding. She logged the inconclusiveness as a datum rather than a concern. I want to pause here because the third through fifth transmissions are, on a first reading, the most unremarkable section of the file. They are progress reports. They confirm the fleet's position, the fleet's integrity, the continued presence of the human vessel at a distance that slowly decreased. They are, in form, identical to thousands of progress reports in thousands of other files in this archive. A reader moving quickly through the file might skim them. In 47 void final files, I have never skimmed this section. I read the third through fifth transmissions of every file with the same attention I give to the final ones, because over 61 cycles, I have learned something about what this section represents. It represents the last time the commanders in these files were certain they understood their situation. The third transmission, the fourth, the fifth, these are the transmissions of beings who have a model of what is happening and who believe in that model. The model may be wrong. In all 47 cases, in one way or another, it was wrong. But in the third through fifth transmissions, they do not yet know it is wrong. And there is something in that, in the specific texture of confident, competent reporting from people who are walking towards something they do not yet understand, that I have never been able to read without feeling a version of the weight I described earlier. The Harith commander's third through fifth transmissions are exceptionally good examples of this type. Her analysis is precise, her observations methodical, her tone exactly calibrated to professional competence. There is not a word out of place. She is, in those three transmissions, exactly the commander a civilization would want at the head of an operation like this. She noted the human vessel's continued unhurried movement and analyzed 11 possible implications without settling on any. She noted the absence of other vessels in the scan radius and noted that this was consistent with several scenarios, including scenarios that were not concerning. She noted that the fleet's morale was high. She was doing everything right. I want that on the record. I read the sixth transmission. By this point, the fleet had been inside the Pale region for 31 standard hours. The commander's tone had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a casual reader, but I have read 47 of these files and I know what the change means. Her sentences had become slightly shorter. The subordinate clauses that usually armored her prose like flanking formations had thinned. She was filing more frequently than protocol required. She noted that the fleet had detected no hostile activity, no other vessels, no installations, no scan returns suggesting infrastructure of any kind within their current scan radius. She noted that the human vessel was still present, still on its unhurried heading, still not responding to their hails. She noted that her tactical staff had begun referring to the situation informally as the lead, because it had the quality of a hunt in which the quarry is leading you somewhere, not fleeing from you. She had forbidden her staff from using that word. The seventh transmission, 49 hours after crossing into the Pale region. The fleet had detected, at extreme sensor range, something that the commander's science staff had classified as an anomaly and declined to classify further until they had better data. It was not a vessel. It was not a station. It was not, as best they could determine, a natural phenomenon of the kind the region's limited survey data would lead you to expect. It had a quality the science staff described as organized, which in the specific vocabulary of Harith survey methodology meant that its structure displayed regularities more consistent with manufacture than with natural formation. It was very large. They had not yet been able to determine how large, because its boundaries, if it had boundaries, lay beyond their current sensor range. The commander noted that the human vessel's heading was consistent with a course toward this anomaly. She had filed an updated probability analysis. No explanation had reached reporting confidence. She logged the analysis as inconclusive and noted that she intended to maintain the pursuit. I have read this transmission many times. I have read the equivalent transmission in 47 other files, the one where the record crosses from the realm of the expected into the realm of the strange, and the commander or fleet admiral or expedition leader makes the decision to continue rather than withdraw. In all 47 files, they continued. I used to wonder, early in my career, why. Why, when the situation had already announced itself as something outside the established parameters, did they always continue? I know the answer now. It is not a complicated answer, but it takes 47 files to understand it fully. They continued because the part of themselves that evaluated the situation said continue. The Dravathi continued because withdrawal would have violated their cultural code of collective commitment. To turn back when the fleet had already committed was, in their ethical framework, a form of cowardice so severe it was almost literally unthinkable. The Kuhn Collective continued because their council structure required a unanimous decision to halt an authorized campaign, and unanimity on a question that size, under those circumstances, was procedurally impossible to achieve within any time frame that would have mattered. The Savith continued because their entire civilization had been built, for 400 years, on the narrative that this moment would be the moment of their culmination. And you do not turn away from 400 years of collective meaning because your censors have returned something classified as anomalous. The Harath continued because continuing was the grammar of how they experienced being alive. 8th transmission, 58 hours in, the anomaly had resolved itself partially on improved sensors. It was not a structure in the conventional sense. It was, as best the Harath science staff could determine, a region, a specific volume of space that had been, in the words of the science officer whose analysis accompanied the transmission, worked. She used that word carefully, noting in her annotation that she could not identify a more precise term in the Harath technical vocabulary. The region showed signs of what she called working in the sense that terrain can be worked, shaped, altered, made to serve a purpose that was not its original natural state. The scale of the working was not yet fully determined. The purpose was not yet determined. There were no visible power sources, no detectable energy emissions, no electronic signals of any kind. The region was, in every conventional sense, quiet. She found the quietness the most significant datum she had recorded. The commander's note appended to this transmission was brief. She confirmed the science officer's findings. She noted that the human vessel had not increased its speed. She noted that the fleet had not lost contact. She noted that she would maintain the pursuit to the anomaly and complete a survey before determining next action. Her note was 11 words shorter than her previous briefest transmission. 9th transmission, 66 hours in. This is the transmission I had read before I came here tonight to close the file, because the junior archivist assigned to the initial intake review had flagged it with a query notation asking whether it required specialist linguistic analysis. I had reviewed her query and told her it did not, because I recognized the transmission type. I had seen 47 equivalent transmissions, each in a different language, each from a different species standing at what I privately, in my own notes that I keep in a personal cipher no one else will ever read, call the last clear moment. The last transmission before the record begins to show what I think of as the fraying. The fraying is not a technical term, it is my term. It describes the quality that final transmissions have, the quality that makes them, when read in retrospect, clearly final, even when the sender had no way of knowing they were final. Something changes in the language, not the words themselves necessarily, and not the tone in the obvious sense. Something in the structure of the sentences, the way the clauses relate to each other. The Harith commander's ninth transmission was, on its surface, a routine progress report. Position confirmed, fleet integrity confirmed, human vessel still in contact, anomaly now within standard survey range, preliminary scans ongoing. All routine. But the sentences had changed shape. The Harith rhetorical tradition built its sentences like pursuit formations, each clause advancing, each subordinate protecting, driving toward an inevitable conclusion. The commander had written in that tradition for 8 transmissions. In the ninth, the sentences had changed shape. They were still grammatically correct. They were still factually precise, but the clauses were no longer advancing. They were, each one, complete in itself, containing only what it needed to contain and nothing more. The junior archivist had sensed something wrong with the transmission without being able to identify what. She was right to flag it. The something wrong was that it was written by someone who had, on some level below conscious articulation, stopped expecting to write another one. I told her it did not require specialist linguistic analysis. This was true in the sense that no analysis was going to change the fact that it was transmission 9 of 9, and that the file contained no transmission 10. But I had not at the time. Read what came after transmission 9 in the file. I had read the intake summary, which noted that the fleet had ceased communications at a specific point in time and had not resumed, and that subsequent search operations by the Harith had found no trace of the fleet, and that this absence had initiated the long political unraveling of the Harith Empire's will to continue pressing its territorial claim, and that 312 cycles after the incursions beginning the Harith Empire had, quietly and without formal announcement, ceased to exist as a unified political entity, its component systems having drifted into various states of independent administration, decentralized governance, and in the outer territories, simple demographic dissolution. No war, no coup, no conquest. The Harith Empire had simply, over 3 centuries, run out of the forward motion that had been its organizing principle, and without forward motion, it had no other principle to hold itself together, and so it had come apart the way that things come apart when the force that was holding them together is no longer being applied. I had read the intake summary. I had not yet read the section of the file the Harith themselves called the final search records. I read them tonight. This is what I need to explain, and I need to explain it carefully, because it is the reason I am dictating this closing record at the 3rd watch, alone in a sealed chamber, into a file that will not be opened again. The final search records are the documents generated by the Harith after the incursion fleet ceased communication. 3 separate search expeditions were sent over the course of the following 40 cycles. They were not combat expeditions. By the time the first one was launched, the Harith political situation had already shifted enough that a full military mobilization was not supportable. They were survey expeditions, tasked with locating the fleet, or the fleet's remains, or any evidence of what had occurred. I had assumed, reading the intake summary, that the search expeditions had found nothing. That is the standard pattern across the 47 files. You find nothing because there is nothing to find. The vessels are gone. The crews are gone. The equipment is gone. Whatever happened to them in the Pale region cannot be recovered as evidence because nothing recoverable comes back from the Pale region. That is the definition of void final, more or less. The record exists on our side of the line, and on the other side there is a silence that has no content. The search expeditions did not find nothing. The first expedition found wreckage. This is unusual in 47 files. I have records of post-incursion search expeditions finding wreckage in only 3 cases, and in each of those 3 cases the wreckage was found at or near the boundary of the Pale region, clearly ejected or drifted outward. An analysis of the wreckage indicated catastrophic structural failure of the kind associated with specific energetic events. The wreckage told us something in those 3 cases. It told us there had been an exchange of sufficient energy to destroy ships. The wreckage the first Harith search expedition found was not near the boundary. It was deep inside the Pale region. The expedition had traveled, by their own records, considerably further into human space than any previous non-human survey had gone and returned from. They had found the wreckage at a point deep enough that I note, reading their positional data, that the expedition commander's decision to go that far was either an act of extraordinary professional courage or an act of something else that I do not have a comfortable name for. The wreckage was not the incursion fleet. That is the first significant thing. The first search expedition found wreckage, and when they analyzed it, they determined that it was not Harith. The metallurgical composition, the structural geometry, the manufacturing signatures, none of it matched Harith construction. It did not match any species in the archive's database of known vessel construction. The expedition's analysis noted this and offered no explanation for it, because they had no explanation. They photographed it extensively, collected samples of the material, and returned. The sample analysis, conducted on Harith soil by 3 independent institutions over the following 6 cycles, produced a finding that appears in the file without commentary, without annotation, and without any indication that the institutions involved ever publicly discussed what they had found. I have read the raw analysis 3 times tonight. The material is approximately 9,000 standard years old. It is the remnant of a vessel. The geometry makes that clear, but it is a vessel that was manufactured 9,000 years ago. The archive's database has records going back 11,000 years. There is no civilization in the database that was manufacturing vessels of this structural type 9,000 years ago. The file records that the Harith government quietly classified this finding and did not act on it. I believe, reading the political record of the period, that they could not act on it, because acting on it would have required a public acknowledgement of what it implied, and the Harith political system in that period was not capable of making that acknowledgement without consequences that would have been, by the government's judgment, destabilizing. What it implied was that something had been active in human space for at least 9,000 years. Not humans. Humans had not yet, by any record in the archive, developed interstellar capability 9,000 years ago. Something else. Something that built vessels, that moved through that space, that left wreckage there in circumstances the Harith expedition declined to speculate about. I want to be precise about what this data means in the context of the archive's holdings. I have access to Class Absolute, which contains the archive's deepest records going back 11,000 years. I have not opened Class Absolute, but I have read, in the non-restricted portions of the archive's oldest holdings, the records of what the archive calls the predecessor survey period, the earliest era of the archive's existence, when Veth Call explorers were mapping the galaxy for the first time. Those records describe, in the Pale region, a notation made by the survey team that first approached its boundary. They recorded an absence of wrecks and debris of the kind that accumulates in inhabited space over long periods. They found no material evidence of prior habitation. They noted this as consistent with a region never occupied. That survey was conducted 11,000 years ago. The wreckage the first Harith expedition found is 9,000 years old. This means that sometime in the 2,000-year window between our archive's first survey of that region and the manufacturing date of the wreckage, something began operating there. Or it was there before the survey and our survey teams simply did not find it. Both possibilities appear in my notes. I will not read those notes aloud. The file contains, in the personal log of the expedition commander, a log he filed under his own name, not as an official expedition record, a single sentence that I have been sitting with for the last several hours. It is in Harith, and the archive's translation reads, "There is a reason the cartographer stopped drawing here. He retired from survey work after that expedition. The file records this as a voluntary retirement due to health concerns. I note it without further commentary. The second search expedition was launched 18 cycles after the first. It was smaller, faster, tasked specifically with penetrating to the region where the incursion fleet had last been tracked, using the positional data from Transmission 9 as a navigational target. It carried no sample collection equipment. It carried, in addition to its standard survey instruments, a set of passive monitoring arrays designed to record any signal activity, electromagnetic, gravitational, tidal, any modality, without emitting any signal of its own. The expedition commander's stated rationale for the passive-only configuration was operational prudence. In his personal notes, which are also in the file, he wrote that he intended to look without being seen looking. The second expedition did not return. I note this in the same flat register I would use to note any factual datum, because that is the appropriate register for a closing record, and because I have read this same fact in different forms in all 47 files, and a senior curator of the Vethkal archive does not collapse the professional distance that makes it possible to read these files and still go on reading them. The second expedition did not return. That is a datum. It is entered in the file. It changes nothing about the record structure, because the record structure was already determined by Transmission 9. The third expedition was launched 60 cycles after the second. By this time, the Harath political situation had contracted significantly. The loss of 2 expeditions in addition to the original incursion fleet had produced, in the Harath governing councils, a state that the political historians in the file describe as strategic arrest, not panic. The Harath were not, as I have noted, a species that panicked. What they entered was a state of genuine epistemic failure. They could not construct, from the available data, a model of the situation that recommended any particular course of action over any other. Every option they could articulate, further expedition, diplomatic contact with the humans, abandonment of the territorial claim, public acknowledgement of the losses, had, when analyzed against the available information, the same probability of good outcome as any other option, and that probability, in every analysis their councils commissioned, was very low and could not be made less ambiguous. You cannot conduct a continuous advance against an opponent you cannot model. The engine of Harath civilization required forward motion, and forward motion required a comprehensible obstacle, and the humans were not comprehensible in the way that obstacles needed to be comprehensible for that engine to engage. So the engine idled. The third expedition was authorized, after 60 cycles of this idling, not because anyone believed it would produce actionable intelligence, but because the political cost of inaction had finally become higher than the political cost of loss. It was a small expedition. The file records that it was crewed entirely by volunteers. I find this significant and do not annotate it. The third expedition penetrated the Pale region to a depth corresponding to the first expedition's furthest point of travel, and there they deployed their monitoring equipment and waited. They stayed for 11 days. Their records from those 11 days are complete and intact and are in the file, and I have read all of them, and they record exactly nothing. No signal activity, no energy emissions, no gravitational anomalies, no mechanical contact, no visual observation of any vessel or structure or phenomenon. The region was, for 11 days, absolutely quiet. On the 12th day, they received a signal. This is the part of the file I had not read before tonight. The intake summary noted it only as signal received from unknown origin, contents on record. I had not read the contents. I had assumed, as I have noted, that the record contained nothing beyond the standard shape of the void final narrative. I was wrong about that assumption. The signal was a single transmission, origin indeterminate. The monitoring arrays were unable to establish a directional source, which is, the expedition's technical analysis notes, not physically possible under normal conditions. A signal has a source. A source has a direction. The arrays were functioning correctly. The transmission simply did not have a traceable direction. It arrived as if it had come from everywhere at once, or from nowhere at all, or from a place that the array's physical architecture had not been designed to locate. It was in Harith. Not a translated or reconstructed Harith, native Harith. In a dialect the expedition's linguist identified as contemporary standard, with no detectable errors or artificial construction. It was transmitted in the voice. If voice is the right word for a signal that had no identifiable source, of a being that spoke Harith as a first language. The transmission was 11 words. I have the archive's translation here, and I have read it many times tonight, and I will dictate it into this closing record because it is evidence, and the archive preserves evidence, and a senior curator does not selectively exclude evidence from a final record because it is uncomfortable to include. The translation reads, "We see that you are looking, we are letting you leave. Go." That is 11 words. The expedition analyzed the transmission for 9 days, by which point the unanimous judgment of every analytical staff member was that the transmission was what it appeared to be. A communication, in their language from something in human space, addressed specifically to them, acknowledging their presence, acknowledging their surveillance, and authorizing their departure. The word the expedition's linguist flagged for special attention in her analysis was the verb I have rendered as letting. She noted that the Harith verb in question carries a specific semantic load that the translation letting only partially captures. It implies an ongoing state of permission that has been extended as a deliberate choice by someone capable of withdrawing it. The full semantic weight is closer to, we are choosing right now to allow this, the implication being that the choice could be revised. Expedition left. They traveled back to Harith space in a silence that, the expedition logs note, was not broken for the entire return journey. No one spoke on the record. The personal logs of the crew members from the return journey are in the file. I read 3 of them tonight. They record in different ways with different vocabularies the same thing, the experience of being something that was being watched and known, and allowed to continue existing as a specific and deliberate act of allowance. The expedition's botanist. There was a botanist on the 3rd expedition, as there typically was on Harith survey missions, in case the survey encountered terrestrial environments worth cataloging, wrote in her personal log on the 5th day of the return that she had, for the first time in her professional life, understood at a level she could not make abstract or intellectual why every map of the known galaxy ends the same way. She wrote that she understood why the cartographers had stopped drawing. She wrote that she was glad they had. She did not elaborate, the log ends there. The 3rd expedition returned. They filed their records. The Harith government received those records, classified them at the highest level then available, and convened a council session that lasted, by the record of its official duration, 40 days. The council session produced no public statement and no announced decision. The file records, in the political history section, that in the cycles following this council session, the Harith governing structure began, gradually, to change its relationship to the territorial claim that had precipitated the incursion. Not renouncing it, the Harith political tradition had no formal mechanism for territorial renunciation, which was itself a significant cultural fact about a species organized around the principle of the continuous advance. They simply stopped acting on it. The claim remained on the books in the formal sense. The administrative apparatus that had maintained it began, very quietly, to be retasked. Budgets that had supported border operations were redirected. Officers who had been assigned to the relevant sector were transferred to other postings. The sector itself, in the internal working documents of the Harith strategic planning apparatus, began appearing with a notation that the archive's analysts translated as designated non-pursuit. Designated non-pursuit. 3 cycles after the 3rd expedition's return, That notation had been applied to every document in the Harith Strategic Planning Archive that referenced the region the Galactic Atlas marks with the pale featureless designation. It was not an abandonment, it was a judgment. The Harith had looked at the available information and arrived at the only conclusion the information supported. Pursuit in this direction was not a viable operational category. Not because they lacked the capability, not because the cost-benefit analysis was unfavorable, but because the third expedition had demonstrated that something in that space was aware of them in a way they could not reciprocate, was capable of reaching out to them in their own language, and had, when it did reach out, done so not to warn them or threaten them, but simply to inform them that they were being permitted to leave. If you are accustomed to thinking of yourself as a pursuer, and something shows you that it knows you are looking, and it chooses to let you go, the message is not in the words. The message is in the choosing. I have read the council records from the period immediately following the third expedition's return. They are meticulous records, as Harith records always were. The council members' individual position statements are in the file, and I read them tonight. And what strikes me about them, reading them with full knowledge of what the next 230 cycles would bring, is their clarity. These were not beings in denial. They were not minimizing what the expedition had encountered, were not reclassifying it into a less troubling category, were not constructing bureaucratic language to make it manageable. They named it clearly, in the Harith language with all its hunt conjugations, and they noted what it meant for a civilization whose entire identity lived in the opening through completion progression of the pursuit. They understood, and understanding, they designated non-pursuit, which in the Harith verb system is conjugated in a tense that does not exist for actions that are considered temporary. It is the tense of permanent states. The tense of things that have moved into the fourth stage, no longer needing to continue. 230 cycles after the designated non-pursuit notation was first applied, the last unified Harith Governing Council dissolved. This was not a dramatic event. The file records it as an administrative determination, a formal acknowledgement that the Council's membership had, through attrition, retirement, and jurisdictional fragmentation, fallen below the quorum required for binding decisions. No final session. No final statement. The governing apparatus simply ceased to function, and the component polities that had made up the empire continued in their various independent trajectories, none of them large enough or unified enough to constitute a successor to the entity that had, 314 cycles earlier, filed a territorial complaint in language of such rhetorical precision that a junior archivist had paused to admire it before filing it away. I was that junior archivist. I read that complaint 61 cycles ago and found it beautiful. The file contains, as its final document before this closing record, a translation of the last communication the Harith Governing Council sent to any external institution before its dissolution. It was addressed to the Veth Call Archive. It reads, "We are transmitting herewith the complete records of the Harith incursion and its sequelae, for preservation and classification according to your institution's standards. We ask only that the classification applied acknowledge that the Harith sought to understand what we encountered before we withdrew from it. We did not flee. We looked, and we understood what we saw, and we chose." I have read that last line many times. I believe it is true. I believe the Harith understood what they saw better than most, and I believe the choice to withdraw, encoded not as retreat but as designated non-pursuit, not as fear but as a redirection of the same analytical precision they had applied to 300 years of successful expansion, was, in its own way, a demonstration of the thing that had made them remarkable. They had encountered something they could not advance against, and they had recognized that fact, and they had built, around that recognition, a new category. It was not enough to save them as a civilization, in the end. Whether the dissolution of their empire was a consequence of that recognition, or whether the recognition simply accelerated what the internal contradictions of their expansion model would eventually have produced regardless, is a question I have opinions about but will not record here, because opinions are not what a closing record is for. What a closing record is for is this: the accurate, complete, unembellished account of what the file contains, so that anyone who reads it afterward, if anyone ever reads it, understands what happened. What happened is, the Harath Empire launched a pursuit into human space, and the fleet they sent did not return, and the expeditions they sent to find the fleet did not return except for one, and the one that returned brought back a message in 11 words, and that message was enough for a civilization built on the principle of the continuous advance to understand that there are directions in which advancement is not a category that applies, and they built their understanding into their institutional record. And they sent that record to us, and now I am closing it. I am going to dictate the void final classification now. It is a formal statement, and it has required elements, and I have dictated it 47 times before. The Harath incursion file, catalog number 3771-Keth, is hereby classified void final under the authority of Thesavar Dunn, Senior Curator, 3rd Chamber, Vethkal Archive. The event described in this file has no surviving principal parties among the Harath Empire, the Harath Empire having ceased to exist as a unified political entity as described herein. The file is closed not by resolution, but by categorical cessation. No follow-up records are possible from the Harath Party. The human party's status and disposition are unrecorded and are not subject to determination by this archive's current classification authority. The record stands as written. This record, including the present closing dictation, is sealed under class restricted. Access requires Senior Curator authorization or above. The physical media containing the 3rd Expedition's signal recording and the expedition's personal logs are sealed under a supplementary class elevated designation, which requires Governing Council authorization for access, on the grounds that the material in question has, in the judgment of the classifying curator, the potential to affect the decision-making capacity of any reviewing official in ways that may not be operationally appropriate. That is the formal statement. I have dictated it. The classification is complete. I want to add one thing that is not part of the formal closing record. I am going to add it anyway, and then I am going to seal this dictation, and I am going to sit here in the 3rd chamber for a while before I go home. The expedition's linguist, in her analysis of the 11-word transmission, noted the semantic weight of the word I translated as letting. She also noted, in the final paragraph of her analysis, something she said she had included reluctantly because it was interpretive rather than technical, and a linguist's role was technical. She included it anyway. She noted that the transmission, taken as a whole, had a quality she could identify clearly but could not precisely name. The quality of something that was not communicating with the 3rd expedition, exactly, but was communicating at them. As you might communicate at a thing that could hear but could not fully understand. As you might communicate at a very young animal that had wandered somewhere it should not be, and you were choosing to guide it back toward safety rather than toward the alternative. And you were doing so in its own language because you were old enough and patient enough to have learned its language, and because the language was, to you, a small and understandable thing. She noted this, and then she wrote, I do not know how long they have been there. I do not know what has been in that space for the 9,000 years since the wreckage we found was made. I do not know what has been watching every expedition that has ever crossed that boundary, and I do not know what it has been doing in the long intervals between incursions. I know what 11 words in my own language, spoken to me from a direction I cannot locate, feel like to receive. I know what it means to be permitted. She ended her analysis there. The file ends there effectively, except for this closing record. I am going to seal this file now. I have done this 47 times before. I know the weight of it. I know the silence that comes after the seal is applied and the record indicator changes from active to void final, and I know that the silence is appropriate, and I know how to carry it. What I did not know before tonight is the specific quality of the silence that comes after reading the third expedition's records. It is different from the silence after the other 47 files. I have been sitting here trying to determine how it is different, because a senior curator of the Vethkal archive names things precisely, and I have not yet named this precisely enough. The other 47 silences are the silence of loss. They are the silence of a record that is complete and will not be added to, the silence that comes when the last word of a civilization's last communication has been received and filed, and there will be no more words. That silence has weight. I know it intimately. I have learned to sit with it until it becomes bearable. This silence is not that silence. This silence is the silence of something that is not the absence of a thing that was. This silence is the presence of a thing that is, and has been, and does not need to make any further communication because the communication has been made and received, and the necessary action has been taken. This silence is the silence after 11 words spoken in your own language from no direction you can find. 11 words that told you everything you needed to know while telling you almost nothing about the thing that knew it. The Harith understood what they saw. I have read all 47 files. I understand what is in all of them. I have spent 61 cycles in this room with all of this understanding, and I know what the pale region of the galactic atlas means, and I know why the cartographers stopped drawing, and I know why the archive has 48 void final files and why it will, eventually, have more. There is a word in the final Harith transmission, the 11th word, the last word of the 11, that the archive's translation renders as go. The expedition's linguist noted that this translation is accurate but incomplete. The Harith verb in question has, she wrote, a directionality embedded in it that the bare translation go does not capture. It is not simply go. It is go away from here. It is go back. It is go to where you came from and stay there. It is, she wrote, a verb that presupposes a knowledge of where you came from and a judgment about where you belong, and a patience so enormous that the fact of your presence has not triggered any response other than this quiet and unhurried redirection. She could not find an equivalent in Harith. She wrote that she did not think there was an equivalent in any language she knew. She wrote that it might be the kind of word that only a very old thing has occasion to develop. I am sealing the file. I will sit here for a while. I will not say the word aloud.